Welcome to everybody. We're delighted to have you with us this evening for this special event. Tonight's program is brought to you by the Holistic Health Community in collaboration with the Morty and Gloria Wolosoff Foundation. For those of you who are new to the Holistic Health Community, we are a nonprofit corporation dedicated to providing holistic healthcare and holistic education in our local community, and dedicated to creating a model structure for other communities everywhere. Since 2012, we've been holding monthly holistic healthcare days and holistic self-care classes in the Marbletown Community Center and sharing films about well-being and consciousness at the Rosendale Theater. Currently, we have a volunteer corps of 57 holistic practitioners and 25 administrative volunteers. Practitioners offer an amazing variety of modalities, including medical massage, Thai massage, acupuncture, reflexology, attunement, orthobionomy, Reiki, Brennan healing science, Ayurvedic medicine, homeopathy, bioontology, neurofeedback, cranial sacral therapy, herbal medicine, Feldenkrais, Rubenfeld synergies, crystal dreaming, sound healing, matrix energetics, psychospiritual counseling, the emotion code, and much more. We operate according to the principles of sacred reciprocity. We ask our clients to make an exchange by giving a donation if they can afford to do so, or by paying it forward, giving their time and love to help others in need. Since the onset of COVID, we've also offered monthly virtual holistic healthcare weeks. And currently we're offering both in-person and virtual holistic healthcare. Our next virtual week is coming up, the week of December 27th through the 31st. If you're interested, there's information of how to access that on our website. Also, access of Brian's resources. Our website is holistichealthcommunity.org. And now Larry Brown will introduce Brian and our evening's program.
Thank you, Cornelia. I'm so pleased to be here. This is something I've really wanted to work with Brian and put together for a while. And as part of what the holistic health community is doing, our future vision is for us to extend holistic healthcare into one of its primal roots, which is being rooted on the land. We are about to launch a capital campaign to buy a farm and add food growing in a holistic way, in a regenerative way, using permaculture principles to actually have food and modalities and how they all interplay together, that the health of each individual, the health of the soil, the health of the community are all intertwined. And so we hope to bring that forth. And we're working with our architect, Janice Welton, and we have designed several buildings that we intend to build when we land on a farm in the Hudson Valley. And they're all based on sacred geometry and harmonic resonance, the way that ancient people understood how to tune a building, how to tune it to the location and tune it using different kinds of geometries so that they have a harmony and a resonance that you can feel and are palpable, much like how most of us have traveled to different places in the world to experience, whether it's a megalithic site or a pyramid or a temple and stuff. So that's our future vision, and you'll hear more about it as we put this together and launch it in the spring to really go for a capital campaign. Anyhow, let me introduce Brian, and I'm going to read from this little resume here. Brian is a long-term Hudson Valley resident, agricultural consultant, standards developer, and auditor, actively working in the areas of regenerative agriculture and sustainable metrics for cannabis production. He is co-founder of the Denver-based Cannabis Conservancy and co-creator of the Sun plus Earth Regenerative Certification and Cannabis Conservancy simply echoes certification standards for cannabis. He lives and farms in Rosendale, New York with his wife, Tara Johansson, with whom he co-created the Rail Trail Cafe community space in 2014. Now I'm going to hand this off to Brian, and then he'll go as long as he wants. We'll take a break, and then we'll come back with a Q&A. Brian?
Cool, thank you. Are you guys seeing the screen share there? Okay. So, thank you, Larry, and the community for asking me to put something together. I'm viewing this as basically a conversation starter for the community. It's kind of a flyover, broad brush look at what we mean when we're talking about regenerative principles, particularly as it relates to agriculture, and then we'll get into some other pieces of things that are going to apply to the brainstorming around creating this community. Basically, I'm going to go over, regenerative. What do we mean when we say that? It depends on who that is. So I'm going to give you my take on some of what it means, so we can have that context. Then I'll talk a little bit about building soil, which is a core piece of regenerative agriculture, but many other kinds of endeavors or paradigm. From where it is in many places in the world now to something that's more regenerative. And then we'll talk a little bit about how cannabis, when Larry and I first started talking about this, that was, an expressed desire for him and the communities to talk about what this means, and in the context of New York too, because this is going to shift in a very big way over the next 2 or 3 years. So talk a little bit about how that might be a vehicle for economic development as a part of the community, or in in a broader way as well. And then I'm going to just throw out a few questions around planning community based around agriculture as a core component. There's some basic questions to start asking, and this is really to get the conversation started, and some of this will feed into the second part of this discussion, and hopefully people will have questions and comments about that, because like I say, I wanted this to be kind of a conversation starter for the community. So, talking about next steps for the community, and then we'll take a little break, and then we'll discuss and answer questions as you have them. So what do we mean when we say regenerative? I have found all different kinds of short snippets that I think kind of encapsulate some of these ideas, and I'll be throwing them in there. But one that I liked is building a truly regenerative ecosystem means considering and caring for all parts of the system, from the land to the culture to the economy and the people, recognizing the local and global context in which they live, exist, and interact. It's nice because it's very broad brush, but it gets those basic ideas in there. Where are we right now? Well, primarily, most of us are part of an extractive model of existence, kind of a linear way of thinking about our economies, and for many people, their lives. It's very kind of reductionist, materialist. It's based on an extractive economy, taking out resources from the earth, manufacturing, creating things that we use, consuming those, discarding them primarily as waste. And this is by nature an unsustainable self-terminating system. In other words, it's kind of slow suicide. And we are seeing the signs of that all around us. Here's some basic kind of overviews of what we're looking at here. Like I said, a linear economy, very much grab and use and throw away. Even in a slightly better system of industrial recycling, where you might have multiple uses, you still have that waste, that trash paradigm. And you may be doing local disposal or recycling, but it's still based on that petroleum extraction model. Circular economy gets a little bit better, but it's still based on an extractive model. And in a regenerative model, you're concentrating on local production, community supports. It is past or trans petroleum. You try and keep the loops within the community connected. So it regenerates, it's just not extractive. So that's a very broad brush. The opposite of that, which is what we're all trying to envision, a regenerative model, not just of agriculture, but of a way of conceiving of how you're living your life. Design as nature. So in other words, using nature as a template for how you're designing your energy flows and your economies. Maintaining an ecosystem integrity. So the strength of the ecosystem that's supporting you is a primary driver of how you design a system. Safeguarding diversity, nurturing systemic health, and strengthening the planetary life support system. So this is a very broad definition of regenerative, but I think it includes all those pieces that you need as a base to enable you to venture out into other pieces of what different people have developed as regenerative economics, regenerative agriculture, regenerative social structures. So regenerative design is about a cooperative, creating a win-win future where the individual and the community and the planet win. Social, ecological, and economic benefits mutually reinforce each other through an integrative whole systems design. Whole systems is the key there. So just as a side note, most of the background pictures that you see are things either from my garden or some of the farms that I have inspected as a Sun and Earth cannabis grower, or inspector for the Sun and Earth standard or our Cannabis Conservancy standard. And those growers have generously allowed me to share their photos with you, and I'll get into breaking as we go through it. So, so what we're doing with regenerative agriculture in general is shifting the paradigm from one that competes with nature, disturbs the soil, typically is monoculture, and is reductionist, materialist, to one that partners with nature, protects soil, protects and enhances diversity, and is a holistic systems model. So that's a very broad overview, and we can talk of that in our discussion. So specifically, what are some of in regenerative agriculture? I found this and I thought it worked really well. I was trying to put together one that had all of these things, and this one just worked a lot better under time constraints. So this includes all the things that I think of in a regenerative system. We'll do that lower part first. So the kind of the social benefits, you're building healthy farmlands and preserving those, soil health, water holding capacity, you're reducing erosion. You tend to increase production over time without external inputs. And most importantly, and we could also talk about this, it adapts over time to the effects of climate change because these kind of systems are by their nature very creative and co-creative. So they're responding to what's actually going on from day to day, month to month, year to year. It tends to support the farms and the farm workers on a much more holistic level, reducing exposure to harmful chemicals, improves, revitalizes rural economies, which we desperately need right now, reduces time, labor, input, fuel costs. Those are spread out in a different way as compared to kind of monoculture agriculture. Improves the quality of life for the farms and the farm workers. Protects local environments, diversity, wildlife habitats, reduces air and water pollution from manure, pesticides, dust created by heavy use of machinery, reduces the use of synthetic chemicals, and I would say in general totally eliminates the use of synthetic chemicals in a regenerative system, and reduces what we would call waste within a system, so everything works in a cycle. And there's some other benefits there to families and the overall impacts of the kind of agricultural endeavor. So some of the key components, and we'll get a little deeper into those as we go down, cover cropping and crop rotation, so that the ground is never left exposed. The soil is never left exposed. Composting is a key component of that and part of that cycling within a regenerative system. Perennial plants and diverse cropping. So that diversity is key. I'm very interested in perennial plants as food producers. One of the things, and you'll note up there some letters that say Kernza, and I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that, but there's a project in the Midwest called the Land Institute, and West Jackson has been working on creating a perennial grain crop, and they have come up with that. It's based on a moderately sized wheat, and perennial means that it comes up every year. It's a grass that grows, comes up, you get grain, you cut it down, it grows back every year. So there's no tillage, there's no soil turnover like traditional grains. So we need to be exploring some of those kinds of things. In most regenerative systems, there is typically a livestock component. In this one, they're showing managed grazing, which can enable you to do a lot of things like initial land clearing, things like chicken tractors, and some of you are probably familiar with these techniques. So zero or low tilling and mulching is another key component of that. So those are kind of the big pillars. The other really big one, and it comes up a lot in discussions, especially around cannabis, is the ability to store carbon, capture carbon, store carbon. And that is another piece of this. There's a lot of real interesting work being done around how to quantify that so that people who don't really get regenerative agriculture in all the other ways can see it as a way to capture carbon. All right, so soil is the root of all this, and I totally ripped this off from George Jacobs' idea out, the soil to soul idea, which I think is beautiful, because one of the things that one of the ways that I've come to start thinking about building gardens and regenerative practices and some of these pillars is to not just consider them for agriculture, but also how we build community and social structures. So the same things apply in both of those. So as building soil and gardens is very much like building community. But I love that soil to soul. And I don't know if George is on here, but I'm giving him credit. He may not have made that up, but I thought it was great. So basically, healthy soil, healthy food and plants make healthy people. All right, some of those core principles. Keep the soil covered, minimize soil disturbance, maximize crop diversity, maintain living roots in the ground year round, integrate livestock, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It doesn't mean bringing cows on necessarily, and closing the loops. What you're seeing in the background of that shot is I think you can make out a lot of that. That is a nice chop, what they call chop and drop of a cole crop of some kind. It was a cabbage crop that's just going to get mowed down and left there to compost, and then other stuff will be added on top. This is a beautiful farm in Northern California called Radical Herbs. They are a combination Demeter biodynamic certified farm and a cannabis flower producer. Really interesting. Okay, so what do we mean by keep the soil covered? These are shots from my place, my garden, from a couple of weeks ago. One of the things that I work with are hugel mounds. For those of you who've been to my place, know that we have, we're at the edge of a wetland. We have very wet conditions. So what we've had to do is build our growing area using a technique called hugel culture, which I'm not going to get into a lot here, but I've passed on some resources around that, and we can discuss it a little later. So what we've done is build these beds up, and I keep things covered in a couple of ways. One is with straw or some kind of mulch, sometimes leaves. You see some comfrey plants hanging on there and some mint over there. The other thing I do is do a cover crop, usually in mid to late September, of something that's going to grow and hold the soil. I really like peas, which are here. They're all brown now. But what they did was create a really lush kind of mat. And then they have died back. They have captured, they've created nitrogen in the soil because they're a nitrogen fixer. And then within that, I have some Swiss chard that's still hanging on there. So I always try and combine those things. Minimize disturbance. So one of the things that's I think key is learning how in your system to minimize the disturbance to the soil, to the extent that basically all you're doing is moving aside your stubble or your compost layers or your straw, planting your transplants or your seed, and that's it. Really nothing else is disturbed. So that's typically a way to do it. It necessitates, for smaller kind of farming, hand planting, which has a lot of advantages, but we'll talk about this later, a lot of labor. There are folks in the area who are doing no-till corn. So they've been doing this for a number of years. So what they do is, this is last year's stubble from an overwintering grain. They just run down through that, mash it down, and then they planted corn in there. So without doing any kind of tilling or anything else. So what you'll also see in here is I've lifted some of the language from the holistic health community's mission statement. I believe you call it something else, but it's beautiful. It's kind of the principles that you guys have used. One of those was, in community, we create something grander and more complete than any of us alone, like cells in the body that together create a coherent being. And I love that. And then when I saw this picture, I said I wanted to combine these two. So this is another technique that I use with the hugel cultures. It's a combination of indigenous plants and what I call my anchor plants for new hugel beds that are a year or 2 years old. What they do is work their roots down, create passageways, homes for microbes and other kinds of things. So what we've got here, for those of you who are maybe dealing with these plants in your gardens, you have Joe Pye, a super strong plant, but it can get in the way. But I like it because it holds a lot of soil. It has very deep tap roots, so it's constantly bringing things up. This plant is probably 4 years old. All I do at the end of the year is whack it down, lay the greens down on top of the bed. Those decompose for next year, and I'll put compost on top of that. So we have Joe Pye weed. We have some yellow squash. We have some cannabis. We have some dandelion. We have burdock, which is, the bane of many gardeners' existence. I like it because, again, it has a very big taproot that goes down and brings up a lot of nutrients to levels in the soil. I've also got elecampane, some astragalus. So what it is, it's a community of cultivated things, brought in medicinals, and then indigenous plants here. There's also some motherwort and a few other things in there. So it's a really beautiful community, and I meant to go out and take a picture of it now because it's changed its architecture a little bit, but all of those plants at the base, especially the greens, which are still very edible, have a really nice foundation. So next year it's going to take off even more. So what do we mean by maximizing diversity? There are a number of ways to think about this. It's very important in a community to have diversity, the same in your plant community. I like to think about plant guilds, like what I just showed you. So plants that serve different purposes within a small ecosystem. Companion planting, which most of you who garden know about. Certain plants can benefit each other in a variety of ways. I like combining native and cultivated for a number of different reasons. It's very interesting, and it's especially for me, it's been important to see how those native perennial plants actually work with things I'm bringing in, like squash or greens or something else that benefits from those micronutrients and the microbiome that's being created by those perennial plants. So sometimes you want to be able to throw in something there that's going to be a moneymaker. So you have to figure out how that's going to work. That might be where cannabis comes in. Could be many other things as well. Restorative plants, those are things that can do some bioremediation. Hemp is also very good for that, but there are a number of different plants which can restore the soil biome. Really important to include some kind of heritage or heirloom varieties in your mix. One of the biggest threats to agriculture is the concentration of ownership of seed and seed IP, intellectual property, and the loss of diversity of open pollinated varieties. There is an awareness around this, but small growers in community are the way that's going to be preserved. Large corporations don't really have an interest in that other than to keep this stuff in storage to pull DNA from to use in other kinds of breeding. But it's important that we have it because you're constantly producing your own seed. It becomes more adapted to your niche. It's important to think about plants that have multi-use, so food, fiber, compost, or different kinds of ferments that you can use that for. And then one of the things I think is really important, and it took me a long time to really wrap my head around it, is looking at the inherent strengths in the existing plant community where you land. It may not seem very diverse, but there are ways to take clues from that context and use them to your advantage as you're developing your agriculture. Maintain living roots, super important. We don't think about in the winter here so much, but it's those roots are working all the time. And that's why it's important to keep that mix of perennial plants there that are actually just hanging out. They're not dead. They're just working underground through the winter. So that's another really important part of a regenerative system. Incorporating livestock. So I think of livestock very broadly. It can be chickens, it could be llamas, but worms are certainly a very important livestock piece in a regenerative system. If you don't want to go the route of larger animals, for whatever reasons you don't want to include those. Worms are super important. And don't forget over there on the lower left, that's a picture of I believe that is a corn root and the microbiome that's on that. So your livestock, so to speak, is under the ground all the time working. So my conception of it's a little broader than other regen folks or permies who kind of dog me on this. But I think it's a valid way of thinking about it. Okay, and finally, and this is a broad concept that applies in agriculture, but also our lives in general, is closing loops, circulating the energy, the financial resources within a local economy or ecosystem as much as possible, and minimize those external inputs. And I just heard something very recently about the huge inflation in prices for conventional nitrogen sources, ammonium nitrate and some of these other things that is heavily used in conventional agriculture. The prices have tripled in some places, and that basically takes the incentive away from a lot of growers to even plant, because that's going to cost them money in the end. So we're at this place now where going organic may be the default for folks who didn't think they were going to get there. So we'll see where that goes. But those external things are more and more going to be cost prohibitive for agriculture. So a lot of these closing the loop pieces you're probably already doing. Composting is one of the most common ones, and one that we could talk about endlessly, but there's lots of ways to do it. You can be pretty casual about it and still get some good benefit out of it. Seed saving and breeding, what I was just mentioning, that's a loop that really, if you can do it to any extent, start saving seed. And it's amazing how much seed you get out of a very small space, or 10 cobs of corn, or a bushel of dry beans. It's a beautiful process as well. So nitrogen fixing, nutrient trapping cover crops is another way to close a loop. On-farm mulching with materials, and like the chop and drop that I showed you before. If you can grow straw and use that, I use a combination of leaves, shredded leaves, straw, other kinds of plant material that is right there, so I don't have to bring things in. Compost teas and simple ferments are a way to take those plants and the microbiome that's right there and use it to enhance the soil microbiome. Korean natural farming is a really interesting piece. I'm mentioning it because it's become very hip and fast. Old style of farming, but kind of codified by a number of different teachers. And I like to call that kind of farming local microbes, because a big piece of that is actually methods for collecting the microbiome that exists where you are and enhancing your growing area with that. So that's a great way of closing a loop. Water recycling, if that applies in your area. We're very fortunate here to have abundant water most of the time. A lot of other places are starving for water constantly. So the way they develop their systems is different than we will do. And then material creation and reuse as a part of your process. The more things you can make on farm or in your garden that you don't have to buy, and reusing things that you have in place. I mean, we live in such a material culture, and those things that would be really handy or so useful are easy to get. So you fall into the pattern sometimes of going after those rather than thinking about ways that you can just use what you have. It's not just a money saver, it's a resource saver. Because if you buy more stuff, it encourages those companies to make more stuff, which uses more resources, like that. So that's kind of a quickie overview of regenerative practices, some of those pillars, and the way I think about them and have used them where I am. So the next little thing I wanted to throw out there is talking about the cannabis economic drive and community vitality. And there's a lot of different ways to think about that. So why cannabis? Well, I think there's a number of reasons. Cannabis right now in our current modern context is a real paradigm shifter for a lot of different reasons. It's an economic driver. It has a very rich cultural history. It's a plant that can be used in multiple ways. It's a really good addition to polyculture systems of agriculture. And there's a huge amount of cultural momentum now around the plant. Some of that total hype and bullshit, some of it really important. So what do I mean by a paradigm shifter? Well, it's the way people are starting to think about the plant and its history and the war on drugs and all these things has really started getting people to think about how, how that social transformation needs to happen around legalization of cannabis. Reparative justice, fortunately, is a big piece of New York state's law. And we hope all of the things that get created as a piece of the cannabis community in New York really underpins that. It's a plant-based medicine that has a very rich history and a lot of different ways to use it. It's very self-empowering if allowed to exist in a free kind of agricultural setting or a social setting. And there's a lot of ways to talk about self-empowerment, but it's also it's a mind shifter. This could tend to shift us away from like a corporate oriented consumer culture to one that's much more supportive of self-generated solutions to things like healthcare and all of that. And the public's perception is shifting quickly and in many ways in the right direction around this. So the plant is powering all that. And I listen to the plant as much as possible. A real economic driver, potentially, co-ops, micro businesses, value-added products, cannabis tourism, education and training, and it's something that can be community controlled. That is a picture in the back of one of our certified growers in the Northeast Kingdom in Vermont. So the notion that you can't grow large cannabis plants outside in the Northeast is a fallacy. And it's fall, as you can see from that. So let's talk about some of these things because I think they're important about in our Hudson Valley context. Co-ops give you an increased power in the marketplace, a shared vision and resources, and a regional emphasis, which is going to be very important as the various geographic niches get figured out with cannabis all over the world, but especially in our different growing regions in New York. This is a picture of one of our certified co-ops in California called Grass Valley Growers. And some of you may be familiar with Grass Valley up in Nevada County. They are a group of about 12 growers who've come together to pool resources and their marketing together. So all the growers use this, but then their individual farm information is listed on that. And that one is from Down Ohm Farms, which is one of our certified growers. You'll probably see a couple of pictures from there. So those micro businesses, and this is going to be important in New York as that definition becomes defined in the regulations and we move forward with small scale businesses. So it's producers like small farms, small scale processing, such as this small scale on-farm hash producer there, drying and processing. This is another huge one that people don't think about until it's too late. And that's what happened with a lot of hemp growers over the last couple of years. They plant a lot of hemp and then have nowhere to dry and process it because they didn't think about that beforehand for whatever reason. So there's great opportunities in building infrastructure for drying cannabis. And then delivery is another one of those things that I think is going to have a lot of potential. for a number of different reasons, depending on how the licensing goes in New York. Cannabis tourism, I think in New York is, I think we have the chance to be a leader in this. And it doesn't just mean go out to a resort and get high and sit by the pool. It's all of the things that you can think about relating to the plant, farmers markets, on-farm sales and dispensaries, farm internships. So people come and learn how to grow the plant organically, regeneratively, plant medicine workshops. Some folks have even gotten in touch with me about, the possibility of doing an arts venue on a farm with a consumption lounge and things like that. So there's a lot of different kind of tourism pieces around this. The other one is something called, it's a cannabis friendly or 420 friendly B&B idea that already exists. I met the people in Denver about 5 years ago, and it's called Bud and Breakfast. You can go check those folks out. It's like Airbnb, but for experiences and places to stay that are friendly to cannabis. So all of these things are possibilities. Here's a picture of one of our certified farms in Trinity County called Soul Spirit Farms, and what they've done, because they needed to. They're very small growers. They don't make all their money selling cannabis. They also do tree fruit and other things. But what they realized is that they're way out there, and people do want to come and have a wilderness or a rural experience, also be able to buy cannabis or experience that, and have this kind of experience. So they put up these tents and little campsites, and they have a whole scene there. And what they've been able to do is to bring the buyers up from LA, put them up and show them their wares, so that they can make that kind of rural urban connection. So, and that drives some of their business. They're actually able to fuel their cannabis business that way. And this is one of the inside of their tent. So it's a glamping kind of thing, but infused with the cannabis piece. What's going to be really important in New York moving forward, and I see is possibly an opportunity down the road for the holistic health community, is a center for training and education, not just around cannabis, but around regenerative agriculture. We're going to need lots of sites that are going to be able to host people for workshops and other kinds of things like that. So we've talked about the idea of a grow school, or different sites that can be part of a grow school. So in addition to that, nursery and breeding and seed production are going to be another huge piece of the puzzle here in New York. That whole thing now is kind of a gray area, the sourcing of seed and plant material. So, and we can talk about that if you want later, but it's a really unique opportunity for a community that didn't want to get into growing a whole bunch of flower to sell, but did want to provide seed, get involved with people who are doing seed breeding, not just cannabis, but heritage seeds of all kinds. So that's a possibility as well. Cannabis has a very rich cultural history. It's documented to 5,000 years, but it goes way beyond that. It's regionally adapted, so it's all over the world, and it's been the cultivars have been developed in all these different places, so you have all these different plant characteristics, phenotypes and chemotypes, and the plant is culturally very significant in many cultures for healing and transformation. So that's a huge piece. That's a text from about 500 BC, I believe, in China. It's a medical textbook that shows cannabis. So it's been around for a while. If you go to northern India, it's officially sanctioned. A lot of people drink bhang. If you're not familiar with that drink made from cannabis for the Shiva devotions. So a lot of people have heard about Thomas Jefferson and hemp, but I saw this this quote, and I thought it was really telling as well, because somebody who was land-based and one of the quote fathers of the country realized that, once government or corporations start dictating what we're using to heal ourselves and to feed ourselves, we're headed down the wrong path. So that's an important thing to remember. So multi-use plant. Cannabis can be used for all of these different things, and I'm not going to go over them all because I want to leave enough time at the end here, but it it boggles the mind, actually. The things that have been concentrated on most recently are the medicinal and the psychoactive pieces of it, but the plant has a huge number of uses. And Michelle Hinchy actually has introduced a bill in the state Senate to give some funding to the development of hemp-based plastics in New York. And check that out. I know she has it up on her website. But that's a great piece. And those are the kind of initiatives we need to fuel what's going to be happening over the next few years. So lastly, cannabis is a really good addition to polycultures. This is another farm in Northern California called Sierra Sol. All of their production is done like this. So you have cannabis and you have multiple other things in with that. There's some shiso, there's onions, there's a number of other things there. I think it's on this next picture. Yeah, you can see more of that bed system there. Everything they do is based on these principles. This is some shots from Radical Herbs. One of the things that's really important if you're going to build your agricultural system in a community is multiple kinds of cash crops. You, of course, would not want to just depend on any one thing, especially cannabis, for cash. What they do here is pretty typical of their whole farm. They sell at 2 farmers markets. They make herbal products out of these pieces here, tinctures and salves and various other things. And then they grow this flower this is their Sun and Earth certified flower for Brother David's in California. So they have this going the whole time. In the Northeast, one of the things we're going to have to think about is, our climate, the changing climates, which is typically, it seems, going to be warmer and wetter. So this is a shot of one of my hoop houses. It's a mix of culinary and herbal things there. But that's season extension is going to be very important for any kind of way to think about agriculture in the Northeast. I'll talk a little bit about the certification standards, which is how I got into all of this related to cannabis out of more organic and regenerative agriculture. Over the past 5 years, with an organization that I co-founded called the Cannabis Conservancy, we've developed certification standards that address a wide range of sustainability issues in agricultural production. So we do one called Simply Eco, which is it's a very long, broad standard, which looks at production techniques, cultivation practices, harvesting, processing, and especially how you deal with energy use, water, and waste. And those are primarily outdoor growers. And then with the help of Dr. Bronner's, we developed the Sun and Earth regenerative standard, which was based on the regenerative organic standard that hasn't really taken off, but was developed at Rodale. And this is I would say it's a simple standard in terms of its structure, but it's very high bar. It's truly regenerative based on all of those pillars that we looked at before. And it's very hard for a lot of cannabis growers to get that because they are basically monocropping, because they're used to a monocrop into a wholesale market kind of situation. So doing polycultures and other kinds of things like that, you have to be very committed to and have a lot of background and technical skill, as in addition to a real heartfelt commitment to the idea of regeneration. Okay, so these are a few things that I wanted to just throw out here kind of at the end of my spiel for the community, for the holistic health community and us as a community more broadly. So you're going to see some lifts from your goals there. So one of them was you're envisioning organic biodynamic gardens and a cafe serving food from our own gardens and other organic sources, which is a beautiful and important vision if you're going to feed yourselves and hopefully what will be a growing community on the piece of land that you get to. So some of the things that you're going to need to think about to develop that: land base, water, topography, soils, those kinds of things, infrastructure at your site, power, roads, access, very important, neighbors. Some neighbors are very amenable to agriculture, some are not. So it's one that people sometimes forget. A super important one, especially if you're going to do a primarily non-machine driven agricultural system, is your labor. How are you thinking about your community's labor in your agricultural system? Is it all volunteer? Are you hiring? How are you structuring that? What's the economic intention of the agriculture? And how are you going to structure that? It's really important. It goes along with that whole labor piece there. And then your community size, which feeds back into those two. How big is the actual community that's going to be involved in the infrastructure and the systems of agriculture? Those are all biggies, but they're all things that need to get really thought about in detail and broken down as the community moves toward creating the space and an agricultural system. So let's see here. Where are we at in terms of time? Okay,
It's 7:05.
Okay, good. I've been going as fast, and it's a lot of stuff in one go, one flyover. So Here's some more things that you expressed about the land. We agree to maintain a portion of the land in its primordial state. We share the responsibility for the maintenance of the land. We use regenerative principles of good stewardship, fostering the fertility of the land, and we aspire to achieve beauty, balance, and harmony, which is amazing. So, absolutely important in regenerative agriculture is to be maintaining those edges, especially, but also areas within your cultivated area that are in their primordial state for a lot of different reasons, which we could get into later if you would like. So we share the responsibility for the maintenance of the land. This is another big one. It's like, how do you create the structure that is going to maintain the land? And what does maintain the land mean? What does, okay, I'm going to leave it at that because there's a lot of places to go with that. So how are you viewing maintenance, I guess? Using regenerative principles of good stewardship, fostering the health and the fertility of the land. We already kind of looked at that, but how are you going to do that in practice on the piece of land where you land? And aspire to achieve beauty, balance, and harmony. And I thought this is a good picture of that from Radical Herbs. That is a cultivar called coffee, which is not coffee, it's cannabis, but it's called coffee. Okay, so here's some questions that we take a little break and then come back and do questions and discussion. So what regenerative oriented goals do you think are the priorities in structuring the initial building of the community, the holistic health community? How much will the agricultural endeavors of the community be oriented to revenue generation? Should cannabis play a key or a background role in that? And on a broader note, what cultural shifts are you looking forward to related to cannabis? And what ones are you not looking forward to? And finally, what hyper-local energies or projects are you cultivating currently in your life? So there's a lot, we could go a lot of different, but I'll leave that for now. I think we wanted to take maybe just a couple minute break and come back, and then we can do Q&A and discussion.
That sounds good. If people want to put some questions in the chat, we can do it that way, or when we come back, you could just raise your hand and we'll do it that way. Let's take, what, 5 or 7 minutes, Brian?
Yeah, take 5 minutes.
Just so you know, you're breaking up sometimes. I'm not sure if it's your internet.
Yeah, it's my, I hope not too much. Yeah, no, we're kind of out here, as you know, Larry. So
Yeah.
I'm running off a hotspot. So most of the time it works okay. Occasionally it gets a little janky. So, all right, I'm going to stop my screen share and we should be back. Okay, cool. So see you back here in a couple minutes.
Okay. Thanks,
Yep.
Brian.
Yep. Okay. Okay.
Brian, that quote from Thomas Jefferson could not be more timely.
Yeah. Well, the more I read about Thomas Jefferson, you know, the guy was complicated, but in another context, in another time, you know, he
Yeah.
he would have been challenging the system in every way possible, I'm sure, but
Yeah.
whatever. It's just interesting. Okay, so we got time to discuss, or if people have questions that are, longer than the chat, I'm happy to do those, or people have comments and we want to, vamp on or jam on some of those ideas, that's fine too. I'm up for whatever.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate the point that, in looking at holistic health, I mean, there's all kinds of practices and modalities you can avail yourself of, acupuncture and massage and chiropractor and on, but the foundation of it all is clean, healthy food and good soil, and practices that keep creating healthy soil. And then, of course, the question of what are we going to hand off to the generations to come in an earth that's productive and alive and fruitful and stuff. So the intertwining of those, just seems essential. Anybody want to jump in with a comment, the question?
Yeah, just as a follow-up to what you just said, Larry, I have an assumption, but I'd like to check if it's accurate, Brian, that if the regenerative farming was going to be much more geared towards providing food to the community instead of having a cash crop like cannabis, that would result in lower margins, more labor, and greater challenges in general. Is that accurate?
No, not necessarily, because basically what you're doing with all of this is kind of shifting your paradigms about what you mean by a margin. First of all, if you think about conventional agriculture, it's very cut and dried. You have your inputs, your labor, these other things. You sell it, whatever's left over is what you've got. In a regenerative system, all of those advantages and the kind of the spiritual nutrition, all different kinds of things that you're getting out of that practice are not accounted for in conventional agriculture. So there's all of those kinds of things, but a regenerative farm at scale, like some of the pictures I showed you, even if they weren't growing cannabis as a cash crop, and for many, like radical herbs, that's maybe 15 or 20% of their income. Mostly they're doing biodynamic vegetables, and they're doing about 10 acres with 4 people, and they make a good living doing that. But the reason I kind of threw that out is because even if you're pretty clued into the need for organic agriculture and all that, unless you've done it in practice, you don't sometimes realize the labor involved. So it's not so much about thinking about labor cost and a margin. It's more about how you think about, I guess, what you would call profit. There's cash profit, something you can sell to get cash because you need cash to do other things. But there may be, a a cycle back into the community in terms of, for instance, I always think of it now as value add, which is why Tara and I started our little cafe, which is that we were like growing the stuff and you can sell it wholesale, but what if you made salads out of it? What if you hosted plant workshops at the holistic health community space, and you charge money for that, you charge money for the food, you're growing that food, you're adding that value in that way. If you have a cafe on site, you're adding value in that way. So the profit that you're actually making per pound goes up a lot. And then labor is another, what I think of as a somewhat flexible issue within the context of creating kind of that new community paradigm. There's ways to do work trade. There's a whole bunch of different ways to think about it other than just hours and money. So I guess my answer, my long answer there is no, because when you're creating this community, you're thinking of it in a broader context rather than the way typically people think about a business, which is, very simplistic, and regenerative community is very nuanced and complex.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah,
I'd love to jump in.
sure.
I was really just blown away by how comprehensive and thoughtful your presentation was. Your screen shares were just amazing. My wife and I, we've been growing our own food here, she before me. So 35 years later, there are still so many things that, we could do better or need to learn. And, you've introduced, ideas and ways to do things that, come from the models of regenerative and permaculture, influences and whatnot. So this was really, really helpful. We probably would like to participate in being able to grow food and medicine as part of a larger community endeavor, and recognizing that as we age, we will not have the physical ability to do as much as the food, the requirement, the garden, and all of the plants that we grow. We would really thrive if we had other sources of labor, to collaborate on something like that. We want to grow cannabis if the laws, would allow that. We're hoping the laws are going to change in such a way that we, could be growing cannabis for medicine. And, that's something that we'll see in the future. But there's just one or two questions that I would love to ask. The last question on your list: what hyper local energies / projects are you cultivating right now? That one went kind of over my head. I really couldn't figure out what you were asking.
That's the reason I threw it in there.
Yeah. And so if you'd speak to that, and then just in a selfish way to ask, I loved what you said about livestock, including the worms. That was like just, that was really special. And at the end of the year, all we kept hearing about were these, super invasive worms that people were talking about.
Yeah.
That could be like just a terrible soil destroyer. And you're talking about regenerating the soil, and maybe something about, these worms that you could share with us also.
Yeah, no, I think I don't know a huge amount about it. Other than that, what's happened, the red wigglers and some of those related species of worms that are used in commercial worm composting are very aggressive, and typically, and it's not just those. There's some other naturally occurring ones, but anyway, they tend to overtake those parts of the ecosystem that our regular indigenous worms are in. So I need to find out more about that, but that's what I've heard. Maybe Jason knows more about that. I would say, and I forgot to say it at the end of the talk, but there's a PDF which you guys will be able to access. There's 2 or 3 pages of links and other kinds of resources there, some local, some further afield, some things that have been very useful to me. So check those out, because there's tons of other rabbit holes you can go down with all of this stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You want to speak to the question of hyper local?
Oh, yes, the hyper. Okay. So I like the idea of hyper local, which can be as hyper as you, in other words, it's an accentuated concept of locality. So it may be just right on your farm. It may be right in your town. But it was basically thrown in there to get you to think about what that actually means in terms of, energy transfer, regenerative loops, those kinds of things. Because you're probably already doing some of them. If your intent is, if you guys have been growing your own vegetables, for all these years, you're already doing those things. But it was also kind of thrown in there to get people to think about how, I guess it's more of a community engagement question. How are you thinking about those connections, very tight loops within communities? Because it's going to be really important that people in communities, especially like what we have here, which I think is special for a number of ways geographically, but also just the number of people that are kind of moving in the same direction with a rich knowledge base. That's not happening all over the world. So we've got a rich soil in that way to cultivate here. But that was kind of the intent of the question, is how you're thinking about that.
You know what you and Tara have created at the Rail Trail Cafe, this incredible synthesis of clean, high quality food, music and art in an outdoor kind of theater environment there in the trees.
Mm-hmm.
And the amount of people who come there for interaction and social connection and just synchronicities. It's just, if you take that and then if you could add a number of people living in that same environment,
Mm-hmm.
not just you folks, but other folks, or maybe camping or small tiny houses or something for people to actually stay for more than 3 or 4 hours and immerse themselves deeper in it, and maybe work on the gardens and farms that you have in an exchange way. I see that as a template of what's more to come, and that you guys have just kind of laid it out for other people to look at it. Personally, I try and go as often as I can, especially when I know the local musicians. It's just such a uplifting environment, and a little shameless commerce. Your pizza is some of the best pizza in the Hudson Valley.
Woohoo! We keep it simple, which
Yeah.
is but I'm glad you mentioned that, not just because it's us, but because not that we're the only people who do it. We got the idea for doing it from being in other cultures that do have hyper local kinds of economies. They have little chai shops by the road, And really the only people they sell to is just their local community. But it's that idea of the energy, whether it be, human energy or energy embodied in money or whatever, is cycling very locally all the time. And it may go out and come back, but when you've got a lot of local cycles happening, it's much more cohesive, more fun too, There's George.
Yeah, more fun for sure.
Yeah, and
That's important. That's a very important ingredient in all of this.
Absolutely, yeah. Because if it's not fun, it's hard to get people to do stuff that's not fun. I've discovered on some level,
Yeah,
there's different kinds of fun,
and also getting the more hands in the soil. Hands that have been alienated from that for so many years. By concrete or by some man-made structure or concentration, human concentration or whatever.
yeah.
That's why I think the grow school is a really wonderful part of what we can all contribute to to this area, especially to younger folks that are feeling that pull to the land, to nature, to working with nature, to working hand in hand with chickens and plants and insects and the sun and the moon and the stars and the rain and all of that.
Yeah. No, it's gonna happen. Somebody's gonna do it. Hopefully it's you guys.
Yeah.
It's happened. It is. Yeah.
We need the models.
Yeah.
We're
model.
kissing. We're kissing, as Tiokasin would maybe put it, we're kissing the seed that we're putting in the soil now.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Andy, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, Brian, you were going to talk about the wild edges, and I wanted to hear you expound on that.
Oh, okay. Well, there's a couple of important things there. I mean, I took my inspiration for thinking about it from Masanobu Fukuoka, who I was reading, when I was a teenager, basically, really starting to think about this stuff. And so Wild Edges, he part of what he did was really just let things grow and discover in kind of natural shapes and contours in his agricultural system. But there's that piece. But in Korean natural farming, a lot of the pieces that they incorporate into their systems are, there's ways of going out and collecting the microbiome using a number of different techniques to then add to your cultivated areas. So what you're doing is taking those naturally occurring edge environments and infusing your more cultivated areas with that. So then it becomes more, one thing, so that the whole microbiome is growing in that way. And that's a huge piece of it. We're barely scraping the surface in terms of really understanding that, but the older traditions of agriculture already have all that knowledge embedded in it. It's not kind of it's not described in a scientific way necessarily, but all the knowledge is there. Now what's happening is people are getting crazy with the microscopes and everything else. So you have lots of young hipsters with their microscopes, like freaking out about soil biota, which is fantastic. Once it becomes like a hip thing for everybody to know about that, then we're getting somewhere, So that's why what the wild edges are really important. And, for all the other reasons, it hosts wild pollinators, all the, birds and other species that need to be there to do all kinds of things that are helpful to us, especially wild pollinators. That's what I see. I mean, you can go out on any edge and see 20 different kind of wild pollinators. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Andy, to speak more on that, just from what Brian was saying, the big thing with a lot of the regenerative practices is the idea of diversity. And what we've seen with factory farming and industrialized agriculture, and then natural ecology, is that there's a certain amount of kind of Goldilocks area that allows a competitive environment for both the macro and micro, the biological world on the leaves, and then the greater macro ecosystem, say upstate New York versus the Cape Cod. And that when we kind of have a certain amount of diversity, it doesn't seem to change if it's like ultra diverse versus just a good kind of diversity. There's a maximum effect of competition that's beneficial, that balance itself out.
Mhm.
And if we're going to kind of have a hybrid in terms of like, he's like what Brian said about perennial agriculture and annual agriculture, and a dominance of more of the perennial, that when we're not monocropping, but maybe we're tending the land in a certain way, that you're optimal to be more diverse and keep more wild edges just for the sake of competition in your favor. And that's really not a lot of regenerative practices in permaculture kind of acknowledge that, is that we're trying to work within our favor with kind of doing a little less and letting more of a natural effect guide us in how we apply what we want to get out of our land in a way that gives us an abundance and essentially creates a more abundant system for itself than what we essentially try to take out of it. And it and that's kind of the idea with the edge, is to not overwork the land. It kind of keeps us a little more restraint in our human ape mind to tidy up edges and go kind of crazy and get kind of linear and blocky and outside of natural design, which really favors abundance in a weird way. And we try to reverse that in our kind of monoculture, because all we look at is harvests and yields and money, really.
Yeah. Well put.
In wildness is the preservation of the world, according to Thoreau.
I would agree. Wildness on many levels, yes.
Yeah.
All right. Anyone else have any questions or throw out ideas? There's a lot of jumping off points here.
I'll just add that anyone who's looking for some more resources, you already mentioned one of my favorites, One Straw Revolution by Fukuoka, and a couple other great books. Definitely Toby Hemingway, The Gaia's Garden. I recommended that to a few people on the board of NY Small Pharma. He was one of my mentors. Great book on permaculture and regenerative design, but a little more simplified for the backyard garden and the home and the homestead. And then Brian mentioning the perennial agriculture and a little bit more about where we came from in our agriculture and how we got to where we are. Mark Shepard wrote Restoration Agriculture, and it's, in my opinion, one of the best books to date on how we got to modern farming and how to get back to a more productive food source, not, in terms of what we do industrially and how kind of poor it is at feeding our systems, and how perennial food agriculture could solve a lot of issues around hunger and access, and we ignore it for the more industrialized reasons. So those two books, highly recommend if anyone wants to get a little deeper into this, especially for their own homestead. Gaia's Garden and Restoration Agriculture are fantastic.
Cool. Questions and comments. Do not be shy.
So, Brian, you quoted the Holistic Healthcare Community's website with a quote that you said you found strangely resonant. And I just wanted to point out that both what you're proposing, the regenerative agriculture and the Rondout Valley Holistic Healthcare Community, are based in permaculture. And so I think that you see the common threads that underpin both. And it's pretty interesting to see all of the mutations that permaculture is. The transition town was based on permaculture.
Mhm.
I skipped that part. And the holistic healthcare community grew from a transition town movement that was in Marbletown years ago. And that may be why there are commonalities.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, what Maria was saying too, when you start to integrate more than just the plant community, but the human community, and then structures in a whole permaculture regenerative design, and then economies that function in the same way, where the money's recycled, stays in the community and builds internal health and wealth without it being outsourced out into the larger world. You touched a bunch on that, but there's a lot of other pieces in this that as communities and the changing dynamic of the world and climate, we're here in the Hudson Valley have an incredibly rich and diverse community base of musicians and artists and healers and writers, and the list goes on and on and on to draw from. And that's what some of the transition town was looking at. What resources do we have in the town? And in the
We're
community?
about to do a process in Rosendale with the Orton Foundation called Community Heart and Soul. And it's about, it's a 2-year process where you reach out to every community member. That's the first goal, is to reach every single community member and invite them to participate. And then you do like a 2-year process to find out what people like about the town and what they don't like and what they feel like they want to do. And we just are working through our approval with the town board. But it seems to me that comes from like a similar kind of value system and curiosity and growth pattern. I'm very excited about it. You'll be hearing more about it in weeks to come. We're like this far from town approval, so.
Oh, good.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting sounding project. I think, I see people really gravitating towards projects where it's enhancing a community sense of agency and away from a kind of a top-down, government or somebody else is going to create this thing and do it. It's like people are realizing it's like, if you want something that's going to be genuine and responsive, you got to just do it.
Yeah, well, this is kind of a counterpoint to like the strategic planning process where, you have a strategic planner who comes in with some kind of idea of where the town should go. And then he kind of guides everybody to that conclusion. And then you get this big elaborate plan that sits on a shelf and gathers dust.
Yes.
For a bunch of different
involved
reasons.
in a couple of those. Yeah.
Yeah, haven't we all?
Yeah. So, no, but I think, I really think smaller scale so that everybody involved in the process has a sense of engagement at whatever level that is. It gives people a sense that they actually matter in it. And it's like, you just see it so sorely lacking in people's lives in this culture.
Yeah.
It's all been sucked out by, you're a consumer. That's your job. You go work and you get money and then you buy stuff. That's, sadly, that's where a lot of people are. So there's a lot of work to do on that front. People could have a lot more fun doing community building.
And it's a way to overcome the sense of isolation and separation and loneliness.
Yeah.
You look at plant communities, as opposed to monoculture, healthy communities are all interrelated and bringing different benefits, whether it's pollinators or nutrients from the soil or fruit. It's a whole symbiotic, deep relationship. And it's not just the plant world, it's what we need in our communities.
Yeah. Yeah, they're this, it's the same. Well, it's all one thing, but it's like, that's to me that using that regenerative metaphor, not just in terms of agriculture, but for community, it's all communities. It's just, we view them differently, but we play a little differently than some of the other players. Yeah. Cornelia, are you coming on to tell us we're getting near the end of our?
No, I was coming on to ask you a different kind
Oh,
of
okay.
question.
Okay.
I don't even know what time we're supposed to end.
10 minutes or so. Yeah.
Okay. I have for many years been very interested in Michelle Smallwright's work at the Perennial Gardens in Virginia and Findhorn. And I wonder if in your work and experience with regenerative farming, you've been involved at all with working with the Davis.
I haven't. I know about this, but I come from an old, more of a Southern Gothic tradition. I grew up in the South, so talking about plant spirits and all of that stuff is like so it's taken me all of this time to now, at 60 years old, I'm much more cognizant of energy, not our energies, but plant energies, and at the promptings of various people through the years have explored that more, including Linda, who I think was on our call here, Linda Law, who's done a lot of work.
She's not here now. Yeah.
Okay, so shout out to her.
She's still on. I
Oh,
see her
there she
image.
is. There she is.
Yeah, no, Linda's done a lot of work around that. So, no, it all kind of comes together. The more time you spend with plants, the more, and especially those mixes of wild and cultivated, you start seeing how those communities work together. And then you're like, oh yeah, of course. It's like, you just got to pay attention. So. Yeah.
I'm also thinking we are working to design the buildings on the land of our future campus by sacred geometry and so forth. And I know in my studies of biogeometry, a use of certain geometrical forms to enhance agriculture as well. So it's something I'd be interested in finding out more about.
Yeah.
And it's inherent in the plants. You look at a sunflower, or you look at the way vegetables or leaves on a tree, the fractal relationships and how they organize themselves. There's a geometry to it. It's the geometry of music and the geometry of plants. And for us, building buildings that holds that same geometry is honoring and going into, let's say, resonance with the whole way that the universe functions, rather than being opposed to it and out of sync with it and stuff. So I think that's
gardens can be constructed that way too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's all around us. We just have to be
like
aware.
putting a Janessa crystal in the center of the garden. It's creating an energetic field for whatever the garden is.
Linda, you want to say anything?
Well, first of all, I'll apologize for my semi-presence here, but I've been online for multiple hours this afternoon teaching class, so I was kind of like totally wiped, and I've been sitting back listening. But Cornelia, I'm really glad you brought that up. It's something that I just find myself going deeper and deeper into, and I've been working. I have a circular garden out in the front of the little cottage that I rent. I mean, everywhere I go, I have to have a garden. I can't exist without it. And, it just gets deeper and deeper the longer that I'm into it. But I think it's such a it's all of the things that Brian's bringing. And, you know, Brian and I talk a lot, and I've been watching his garden and observing. I'm learning a lot from him about the hugel beds and his way of growing plants together. But I've been, you know, this deeper and deeper dive into a spiritual connection with the earth and all those subtle beings that are there. You know, I think we need to be more and more conscious about it and invite engagement and invite them as part and celebrate them and make offerings to them, but not as beings greater than ourselves, but as our partners. And because that's what they're asking for. They're not asking for us to put them up on a pedestal. They're asking us to co-create with them. And I think we have another whole level of engagement that we can have in that world, the more we can open ourselves up into it. And you know, that's one of the things that drives me. But it's fabulous to see all this happening. And, you know, and to see what Brian, the cafe, my God, it was my savior. I live a mile and a half down the road on the rail trail, you know, and cycling down to the cafe has been my joy during this whole COVID episode. And, you know, and the food, oh my God, you know, and all of it. You know, I'm glad to participate in it, whatever I can in all these aspects. That it's, you know, that's a key part. So, and Michelle Small-Wright, I loved, I mean, I've got all her books, but then there's also Findhorn, you know, and Findhorn's still going ahead. Findhorn's still doing all this. And then there's the, not Linda's Farm, there's David Spangler out on the West Coast, who's now doing some extraordinary things, been doing extraordinary things all along. So that, you know, there are communities of people that are doing all this active creation, co-creation with those worlds that, you know, they are turning to us now, I think, because we've made such a mess of this planet, you know, and that they see us on a disastrous road, and they realize that they, you know, we need to work together. We can't just be solely on our own. We need to be in co-creation with them. So
it's part of the diversity of the land.
Definitely. You know, and I don't talk about it with many people but this is a very special community, you know, and one in which I feel comfortable talking about it. But
I want to support what Linda's saying because it's just real. You have to pay attention to it. And I want to point out that Brian may disavow, you know, like he's from the South, but I think he said on this call today, he said, I listened to the plant. He totally gets it.
Oh yeah. No, I'm not saying, I'm just saying when you come from a background where it's totally poo-pooed, it takes some years of deprogramming.
totally.
For everyone.
Yeah, I mean, my dad grew all our food. I grew up living this way, but he had a, you know, a structured row way of doing it. You know, he wouldn't understand what you're doing, Brian. It didn't. He had to have his rows, and I had to kind of let that go because that's what I grew up with.
Yes, taken a while.
Yeah, I'm still resisting it to some degree in some aspects. You know, but listen. You know, the engagement is there. It's subtle. You know, we have to learn to engage in a very different way. Let our egos go and just open. And being outside in the natural world, which all of you do, you all know about this, you know, because you live it. You know, I would say that was probably true of all of you, you know. But our job now is to just get better at it and open ourselves more and work more cooperatively because it's needed.
Part of why cannabis is becoming legal all over the country now, you know, that's the plant speaking.
Definitely.
That's right.
It's one of the teachers.
Yeah, and you listened and acted on it. And now we have this most amazing law in the whole country now. New York State is setting the example because of the way you're working regeneratively and with the plant, listening to the plant. That's
I know,
the-
and this group, or part of this group, was the first time I ever told anyone that the plant spoke to me, because I didn't know about plants speaking. Now I've, read a lot and I've gotten into it. But when she first spoke to me, like, I didn't want to tell anyone, and you were this Woods, that's where I met you, Brian, too. And I just said it, and I saw the whole room temperature change. Here I thought I was going to be like, and everyone's like, okay, she's the real deal. We got it. I didn't know. But that's the plan. She comes through.
Yeah.
Brian, in the few minutes we have left, what can this group or anyone that's going to listen to this after in supporting the rollout in a really good way of the new cannabis laws in New York State, so that it does what the law actually has allowed for people who are incarcerated, who are now no longer incarcerated? How do they participate? And what do you want to put in here for that?
Well, there's a number. I'll give New York Small Pharma a plug, which is working in a number of different ways on the regulatory side to make sure the law actually turns into regulations that all make sense. So that's, check out that website or get in touch. So that's one way. And there's so that's kind of a direct link to all the stuff that's happening right now. So in general, I think trying to orient yourself away from the noise of all the tax revenue and the money and all of this stuff around it, and view it kind of like some of the ideas I've thrown out here, which is around small business creation, the plant powering community, rather than it, just powering cash accumulation. So those two things, I mean, on a very kind of conceptual basis, that's the thing to keep in mind. The rollout, and for anyone who's interested, certainly get in touch with me. My contact info will be on the PDF of this slideshow that I did, which will be on the website, I think, tomorrow, on your guys' website. So if anybody wants to get in touch with me, the information is there, and I can give you a little bit more detailed update about how things are going there. And there's some other various things happening with that I can get you up to speed on, because there's a lot. But in general, my feeling is that the people involved in the process are a very different group of people than typically are involved in these processes. And I've been involved in a number of states, Colorado, and the working with growers in the disaster that is California's market right now. So I can say that New York it may take a while and there'll be some bumps in the road, but I think the intent is definitely to ground it in the principles of working with small growers, small businesses, and folks who've been heavily impacted by the war, shall we say. So that intent is there, and the people that are involved have a background of being very clear about their intent on that. So the elements are all there. How this actually rolls out over the next year to year and a half remains to be seen, but check with me over the next few weeks. I'm happy to speak with people about it.
Well, if nobody has any other comments, we've hit the 8 o'clock mark. So
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Brian.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Brian.
Brian, thank you.
Amelia. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you for
Good to
all
see
the input.
everybody.
Thank you, the
Thank you so
holistic health
much.
community, and
Yeah.